Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from Qur'anite.com. Today is Wednesday 17th of October 2018 and today I'd like to share some thoughts on the subject of gratitude. Now, we're all aware of the virtue and the sort of requirement for patience in hard times. In the Quranic Arabic it's sabr, and this quality is much valued in certain cultures, certain cultures pertaining to brand Islam and so on. And it's a high virtue. I'm not in any way decrying it, but I do think that there's a corollary to it. There's almost like a sort of related other part of it, and that is gratitude. See, when we're going through the hard times, which come to every life, to the life of the unbeliever as well as the believer, it doesn't make an awful lot of difference in that way. But in the life of the believer, obviously, we see our trials and tests in a broader context. And when they are hard times, as they come to any life, then what I've found anyway is that if you stay focused on the broader context and focused on what it is that you feel to be your mission within the broader context, God gives you grace. It's a bit of a Christianism, but in the Christian parlance, His grace sufficeth. You find that that's true, and almost in the hard times, you do find that the deeper well springs open up, and you can access things that perhaps you can't access the rest of the time. But thankfully, we're not all in the midst of Job-like tragedy all the time. There are ebbs and flows, and in the times, as it were, between the tough mountains, you have the valleys and the times when things are easier. And what I'd like to share is just my thought, which is that gratitude is the sort of requisite virtue in those times. You see, and we lose touch with it because, especially at this time, where most people, certainly in the West, but in even an increasing part of the so-called third world, we are very rich by broader standards, the standards of all time. Materially, we're very rich. So, in some ways, plenitude almost kicks against the human desire or sort of inclination to give thanks to God. We tend to we start to get arrogant, and we start to feel like we deserve it, and then we start getting critical about, this is the wrong type of caviar. So it's just my thoughts on gratitude that I wanted to share. Now, there are many verses on this subject, but I've sort of curated a few, and I'd like to share those and give you my thoughts on them. Now, the first is at 14:34, and it reads, "And he gives you of all that you ask of him, and if you should count the grace of God, you could not calculate it. Man is a wrongdoer and ingrate." 14:34. And it's interesting that it says, "And he gives you of all that you ask of him." It doesn't say he gives you all that you ask of him, but of all that you ask of him. It's a sort of a subset of everything that you ask for. That's what you're going to get. But there's prayer and there's prayer. People who worry a lot, for example, that's a form of prayer. They're almost, as it were, willing into existence the things that they claim they don't want to happen by this unconscious conscious mantra that underlies everything that they're doing. It's a form of prayer. Action is a form of prayer. In fact, it's the most direct form of prayer. So prayer takes many forms. We have this sort of very ritualized idea of prayer, certainly within the brand Islam camp. There is this idea that there's this particular sort of ritual that apparently God wants so much. But even outside of that, we have the concept of dua. And these things, I don't really want to discuss brand Islam so much, but brand Islam obviously conflates an awful lot of this and formalizes it and sort of monopolizes it, and then says it will take care of your, you don't need to do any thinking now because it's all been done. But in the Qur'an, there are certainly instances where men and women pray, where they pray in the sense of make dua, when they appeal to God or ask for God, ask something of God. And So we do certainly have instances of that. But we often forget to be grateful, and it's to our own detriment. And this is really, I think, part of the point that I want to make. So the second verse relates to the first. It's at 16:18, and it reads, "And if you count the grace of God, you will not calculate it. God is forgiving, merciful." And to me, what this means is that God is forgiving, merciful. If you think about all the things that you haven't had, the near misses you've had, the near accidents you've had, the time you nearly fell out the window but didn't, the time that you nearly, the big car nearly came crashing into your car but didn't. How often are we grateful for these things? God is forgiving, merciful. Now, I'm not talking here about positivism. This is not some sort of new age idea. Positivism, as I'm sure people know, has been around. It's in loads of self-help books, and I think was first put about by Norman Vincent Peale. I suppose it must be about 100 years ago now, something like that. The idea that by staying inanely positive, that somehow everything is going to just be better. And that may be true if you had part of your brain removed, but for those of us who haven't had that procedure, just being positive for positivity's sake gets kind of old quite quickly, and actually I find quite irritating to be around people like that. That's not what I'm advocating. What I'm advocating is, or really kind of drawing people's attention to, is gratitude to God. This is completely different from a sort of an amorphous, anonymous type of positivism addressed at no one in particular, but just and is actually in denial of reality. No one's saying that everything is great. That's ludicrous. What we're saying is that remaining grateful to God in the context of whatever's happening, in the broader context of what's actually happening in your life, this is a virtue, and actually has its own reward in a lot of ways. Now, Suleiman, who was the wisest, or one of the wisest and richest men who've ever lived, he mentions gratitude, and in fact it's a part of his prayer. And as I say, prayer does feature in the Qur'an, but it's not a book, entirely of prayer. There are, I don't know exactly how many specific du'as in the Qur'an, but it's not in the thousands. It's it's in the tens. Maybe it's 100. I don't know, but there aren't that many. But it's interesting. It's significant, perhaps, that Suleiman asks God to keep him grateful, and it reads here at 27:19, "And he smiled, laughing at her speech. And he said," now that's in the context of a broader narrative, which I'm not going to get into now. "And he," Suleiman, said, quote, "My Lord, direct thou me to be grateful for thy grace." So Suleiman asked God to make him grateful. So if you're not actually grateful as it stands, then a good way to proceed is to ask God to make one grateful. To continue, "Wherewith thou hast favoured me and my parents, and to work righteousness pleasing to thee, and make thou me enter by thy mercy among thy righteous servants." That's 27:19. I'm just looking at the time here because my daughter's having a class, and when she gets out of it, it's going to be noisy again. So I'm just catching the time. To continue, the wisdom given to Luqman. Now, Luqman, he has no direct corollary within the Christian scriptures, and yet Luqman was given wisdom, and we find out in what his wisdom that God gave him. See, Brand Islam makes a big deal about wisdom in Arabic, hikmah, this thing that they then say was something that Muhammad had, and only Muhammad had, and it's the hadith, and you're over the hills and far away. The Qur'an talks about wisdom in a whole range of different contexts, and Luqman was given wisdom. Quote, "And we gave Luqman wisdom, be thou grateful to God." That was his wisdom. "And whoso is grateful, he is but grateful for his soul, and whoso denies, God is free from need." Praiseworthy. That's 31:12. I'll put these quotes, I'll cut and paste them into the drop down below. And the last one I want to share with you is a prayer that a man should pray when he reaches the age of 40, which is the age of mature reason. This is the age by which you've had enough time to look at the evidence, to see what you believe, whom you believe, and to make your own decisions. You're no longer a child at this point. I mean, obviously there are stages and grades of maturity, but by 40 you've seen enough and to be able to be, I believe, completely culpable on the basis of your own efforts and your own decisions. You're able to think independently of your parents. It's time, if it's ever going to happen, that you will have started to think for yourself, if that's ever going to happen. I certainly prayed this prayer when I got to 40, which is quite a long time ago now. I'm now 51. Quote, "And we enjoined upon man good conduct towards his parents. His mother bore him with aversion, and brought him forth with aversion. And the bearing of him and the weaning of him is 30 moons. When he has reached maturity and reached 40 years, he says, My Lord, direct thou me to be grateful for the grace wherewith thou hast favoured me and my parents, and to work righteousness pleasing to thee, and to do thou right by me concerning my progeny. I turn to thee repentant, and I am of those submitted. These are they from whom we accept the best of what they did and overlook their evil. Among the companions of the garden, the promise of truth which they were promised." That's 46, 15 through 16. So you don't need to acquire either the wealth or the wisdom of Sulaiman in order to pray this prayer, and in order to acquire that kind of wisdom. This is open to all of us, whether it be Luqman, who demonstrated this, or just, as it were, the common people like you and I, just men, normal men, going through our normal lives, dealing with the normal irritations and so on that happen in our lives. And that brings me on to my last point, my final point, which is, as I opened, it's natural that in the hard times that God opens the wellspring, and he does, for those who serve him, to patience, and through patience we find a peace which is, I think, quite troubling to other people. Certainly in the hard times that we've been through, if you're not as emotionally harrowed as other people think you should be, they tend to think that you don't care. It's never the case. It's just that when you can see beyond what they can see, that God gives you a grace. That's what I'm trying to say. But the kind of the other track to that is when the easier times come, and they do come. We read in the Qur'an that God tests man once or twice every year. When we're not permanently in the state of Jobian tragedy, when the more peaceful times come, to be in a state of gratitude, it's a discipline, as is sabr. And these two things are the sort of left foot and the right foot. And you can be practicing one or the other all the time, because things are either getting better or they're getting worse. They're never ever staying still, not ever. And so we have these two virtues that become habits. Sure, you mess it up. Sure, you miss. Sure, you get angry and do that. We all do. It doesn't matter. But just repent and move on. But I think that the highest wisdom, and I'm not claiming to be there myself, but I can see the bottom of the mountain, as it were, is that when the hard times come and one opens the wellspring of sabr, of patience, I think that the people who really practice this over periods of time, and it becomes a habit, and habit is so much of life, it's much underrated habit, is that you can then become grateful even for the hardship. And it's I'm not saying I'm there yet or that it's easy, but I think that if we practice sabr in hardship and gratitude in ease, that maybe God will give us the grace for this, which I think is the highest wisdom of all. And a last point is really to do with, I think that a lot of us, especially living in this culture which is very it's very easy, it might not seem easy, but in a lot of ways it really, really is to kick the can of practicing virtue down the road to such an extent that we never really start. The example that comes to my mind is a lot of Christian, and I'm not inveighing against Christians here, but a lot of Christian sort of preppers whose understanding is that we're living in the last days, and they're expecting the rise of the Antichrist at any moment, and looking forward, or not anticipating perhaps, a sort of Mad Max scenario where they're all going to stand up as the last day's prophets and whatever. But at the present time, they're living as couch potatoes and eating junk food and drinking 14 cups of coffee and caffeine drinks. And what I'm trying to say is, I'm not saying all Christians do this, and if you are a Christian, please don't take offense at this. You have much more significant things in my work to take offense at. What I'm saying is that we have to start where we are, and by incrementally trying, allowing ourselves to be refined in the small things that happen, the small irritations, the small tragedies, they're not getting the parking space, being somebody, all the little stuff, just, if we can learn on those things, like use them as training wheels, we can be ready for the bigger things when they come. But I think that we, in some ways, almost monumentalize the narrative of our own life, expecting this to be this huge thing. And by missing the little stuff, you're never going to reach the big stuff. The journey is little steps. And I think gratitude, of course, patience, but starting and acquiring these habits, this is part of the discipline that we're called to be practiced in. Anyway, I've got to go because my daughter will come out in 2 minutes from her Russian lesson and it'll all start getting very shouty. So that's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Qur'an free using the button in the top right-hand corner, or buy the hard copy there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Qur'anite Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. You can download the audio from my YouTube videos to your mobile device using the links in the drop down below. I recommend meetquranites.com to connect with other Qur'an alone believers. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. And use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short, eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.